this is an effort that comes from the Department of Homeland Security, and it involves national laboratory experts across the nation. This is not a one-person activity, but it has really been a joint federal effort from several different agencies, and we'll talk about the guidance that has recently come out from the federal government on how to save lives after a nuclear event. And as you'll see by the graphics and the modeling that I'm about to show you, it is certainly a catastrophic event, but it is one that a lot of people will survive, especially if they have a few key pieces of information. I had the good fortune of working with state and local communities such as yourself throughout the U.S. as part of this project. And I have a few takeaway messages or understandings from that interaction. Now I list this as starting conditions because this actually happened back in 2008 and 2009. One is that few communities, and actually when we started this, no communities had any kind of coordinated regional response plan for the aftermath of nuclear terrorism. There's a lack of understanding of what the response needs even are. And what is the role of federal, state, and local agencies? I get two basic reactions. One is, we're all dead anyway, it doesn't matter. The next is, nuclear detonation, that's a Fed thing, right? Put yellow tape up around the city, wait for the guys in green to show up. Unfortunately, both reactions lead to a sense of apathy and planning that could get hundreds of thousands of people killed. Why? The critical moments are in the first few minutes and hours of the event. And that is the time when key decisions need to be made that are not going to be made from Washington. And you can't wait for somebody to show up and assess the situation. Those are the kinds of decisions that you need to have thought out of ahead of time and enacted quickly. Unfortunately, our instincts may not be right. And the lack of consensus that we were seeing from the planning guidance that was out there at the time was leading to a confusion to the state and locals that they wouldn't know what action to take. And the wrong action can have very significant impacts. So the first thing we needed to do was figure out what are the appropriate actions. And so we established, I'm sorry for the acronym, the MACWUG, the Modeling and Analysis Coordination Working Group. This is really the point in which DHS, who was engaging the national laboratories and technical organizations across the nation to help answer technical questions about a nuclear detonation, this was their working group to get those folks together. But we opened the doors to anybody who was doing any kind of nuclear effects modeling or preparedness planning and engage them in a process to at least come to consensus where we could on key actions that we wanted people to take. Where we couldn't come to consensus, at least bound the unknowns, because as you'll learn, there's a lot of unknowns. I mean, despite over 200 atmospheric nuclear tests, there was only a handful of tests that actually occurred on the ground and are of the low yield that we're talking about. And when we couldn't bound the unknowns, we at least needed to deconflict the guidance. So we weren't having talking heads saying completely opposite things or without understanding why. I'm going to give you a little sample. We put people into buildings. I know, it sounds crazy, but when you talk about modeling now, the models assume you take the population of DC or New York and put them in the Nevada desert. And so they're exposing them in an open field. We don't work in our cities in an open field. We're in buildings, we're in our homes. Buildings offer a lot of protection, and that's what we tried to model. We're also identifying what kind of buildings are in the environment. There are some very good databases that have been developed by FEMA, HAZUS, which is used to evaluate floods and storm surge. And we understand at the census block level what kind of buildings are in that area and what the population distribution in those buildings is. With that information, we can generate an understanding of what kind of shelters are available. This isn't, fallout shelters from the civil defense, but right here in this building, what kind of shelter does this building offer us? And how does that inform our strategy if a nuclear detonation were to occur? Sandia National Laboratories, one of the partners in this activity, has developed, using these block-by-block analysis, shelter evacuation strategies, where they evaluate breaking down a fallout pattern and figuring out if you go this way, walking out of the area, what kind of exposures would you get, and how does that that evacuation strategy weigh against a shelter strategy? And finally, weather. Well, if you, I mean, we're a little bit north of this map, but if you happen to work or live in this area, I'll let you find yourself on the map for a second, because I'm about to overlay fallout patterns. I'm going to show you 12 different fallout patterns. They were modeled using weather from the 15th of each month in 2006. I want you to watch two things. One, there's our January 15th fallout pattern. Which direction the fallout goes. So you get an idea of the variability of fallout, but also how often you see these cigar-shaped fallout patterns and how often you see something a little bit more interesting. February, March. March is very Gaussian, not so much. Yeah, that's very pretty, sort of a butterfly wing effect there. A swoop goes one way and comes back the other. So you get an idea that it's not always going to be this narrowly confined fallout, that you can have fallout patterns that are fairly complex. And if your strategy is to run from the fallout, you may actually run into more fallout if you don't know exactly where you're going or what the situation is. When we look at our detonation point, that's the area, about a block in each direction, where underground lifelines, water, power, would be damaged or destroyed. That's the area in which larger tunnels, subway tunnels, might be damaged or destroyed. You can see it unfortunately crosses a couple of subway lines at that particular location. But to put this into context of the severe damage zone, the severe damage zone is much larger. So you would have more destruction and effects above ground than you would have below ground. So to get an idea of what the environment might look like during something like this, I pulled a little movie clip from the civil defense era in the Nevada test site that shows what it might look like at half a mile away. So this is the outer edge of the severe damage zone. You can see things happen pretty quick, very dynamic, and in fact you have this sort of washing machine effect as that positive pressure wave moves through, and then it creates a vacuum from the explosion, so a negative pressure wave goes the other way, and it's obviously very destructive. The next zone that they define in the planning guidance is the moderate damage zone. The moderate damage zone for a 10 kiloton goes from half a mile to a mile, and all of that debris in the streets is going to impede an evacuation attempt, and it's going to impede a response planning activity. Getting people moving around is very difficult when you have tens of feet of glass and metal debris in the streets. All right, so that's the moderate damage zone. The last blast damage zone they define is the light damage zone. This ring represents the area in which people are injured by flying glass. Now, glass is actually broken much further out, maybe 3 times that distance. But within this circle, glass is broken with enough force to cause injury. To put that into perspective to that flash blindness that we talked about, that's the range in which during the day that flash blindness may cause injuries and accidents from being temporarily blinded. At night, that effect actually goes much further out. EMP. This is sort of the boogeyman of the Cold War. EMP was a big concern, but it's a little bit different for an improvised device. EMP from the Cold War was the concern about a high-altitude thermonuclear detonation that has this lensing effect in the atmosphere. And that effect really impacted our communications and electric and infrastructure grid. From a ground level detonation, just like it retards or mitigates some of the thermal and radiation effects, it also mitigates a lot of the EMP effects. The areas in which equipment would actually be damaged is sort of captured by that circle. It goes out to about a mile. Equipment might be disrupted further out, 4 or 5 miles. And by disrupted, I mean, well, anybody that's got a cell phone has had the little spinning hourglass where it just sort of goes away and you don't know what happened. You take the batteries out, you put it back in, it'll come back to life. So that's disrupted, which means we can reset our systems, but there is some type of effect. Now, later in this talk, when we get to some planning assumptions, you'll see that there is some concern about cascading effects that we'll get into. But this is the area where you might get some type of immediate electronic interference. It happens mostly close in. This outer area, most of the people in this room, if we were at this range, for example, only a few of you would be affected, your phones would be affected. Most everybody else's would work just fine. All right, so that helps us define the light damage zone, which goes from 1 to 3 miles. And finally, you know, we talk about these things in circles, but they're not. If you look at this image, you can see light structures even out into the light damage area may have some significant damage, but you also find a lot of structures close in that survive just fine. So it's not going to be these circles of effect, it's going to be a much more varied kind of effect. And in fact, I think in Hiroshima, there was a survivor directly under the epicenter. He was in a bank vault at the time. And obviously our models don't take into account every possibility, but recognize that you will have survivors even in the severe damage zone. All right, so once again in our National Capital Region example, we have our blast rings there, our severe, moderate, and light damage zones. Then we have that fireball. That fireball actually, because it's so hot, shoots up at over 100 miles per hour. There's also some blast debris that's created, just like when the trade towers came down, all that dirt and debris in the air from just that destruction in the environment. This is not radioactive. This, in the stem and the cap, is. All right, so one of the things we got a lot of feedback on is, I'm sure I already showed you some of the maps, the satellite view of who died. That's not very helpful from a planning aspect. So the response community said to us, look, stop showing us who died, show us what it'll look like, and what we'll see, what we'll know, and what actions we can take. So we've exported our models into these sort of purple ping pong balls. That represents the cloud. Those purple balls show us what the cloud is going to be doing throughout this process. So you can get an idea, watching that, what you'll know and what you'll see. And in this particular weather, at noon on February 14th, 2009, happy Valentine's Day, we had upper level winds that were shooting across to the east, lower level winds that were moving to the north. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit to get you an idea of what that cloud looks like 15 minutes after the event. 15 minutes after the event, the cloud top is actually over Annapolis. But what you'll see are these contours on the ground. Those represent the radiation levels. So the cloud is dropping these particles on the ground. The particles are giving off this radiation. So there's two areas that you're going to see, the dark purple, which we'll define in a bit, that's a dangerous area, and the light purple, which is the hot zone, represent different radiation levels on the ground from the particles that have settled. I'm going to show you a little animation. Starts at 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45. You can see the cloud, the lower part of the cloud is actually heading north towards us, where the cap of the cloud went out over the ocean. The cloud's gone. After a few hours, it moves off, but the radiation levels on the ground remain. That's because the particles have already settled down, and it's the particles, the radiation coming off of those particles that's the hazard. All right, let's take a regional view. So there's a cloud at 15 minutes, 30, 45. After an hour, the cloud is already out over the Atlantic. But the radiation levels on the ground sort of trail behind that. That's because it takes a while for all those particles to come down from the upper atmosphere. You also notice that the lower part of the cloud is moving to the north with the surface winds. 2 hours after the event, that lower portion of the cloud reaches BWI in this particular scenario with this particular weather. The weather actually shifted in the afternoon and moved towards the south. The lower level winds moved to the south. And so you can see at 6 hours, the cloud is starting to move a little bit south. At 12 hours, the cloud's gone, and we just have the remaining contamination. But watch what happens as the days progress. Day 4, day 7, the hot zone is shrinking. That's the other silver lining of our fallout. Fallout decays, and actually pretty rapidly. All right, so I've already sort of defined these zones, but let's just give them names. We've got our severe, moderate, and light damage zone, and then we've got our dangerous fallout zone. The planning guidance defines this as being 10 per hour or higher, but what I want you to think of is this is the area where you can actually get acute sickness from being exposed. If you stay outside in the dangerous fallout zone, especially if you stay outside in the first few hours of the event, there's a good chance that you would get enough exposure to make you sick or potentially kill you. The other thing that they define, is the hot zone. The hot zone, which you're going to see is very large, is defined as 10 MR per hour or 0.01 R per hour. So it's a factor of 1,000 less than the dangerous fallout zone. It's an area where you'll have radiation. You'll be able to clearly see it on any meter. But it's not something that's going to be of an acute radiation concern. It's an area where if you're a responder, you should respond to save lives. If you're in the public, you should protect yourself, but it's not something that's going to immediately kill you. All right, so we have a couple of examples here. And I'm going to pick on Maryland a little bit. I'm going to go out to Prince George's County Fire Station number 55. There it is, a picture of it in the lower right-hand corner. Very pretty fire station, by the way. Got some sculptures out front. So Fire Station 55, if they saw this cloud overhead and saw the particles coming down and said, that's not good. I'm going to get out my radiation meter and see what's happening. If they make measurements, we're going to see what those measurements are at each time mark at that location. They're about 5 miles from the detonation site. And at 15 minutes after the event, you can see they're actually a little bit north of the dangerous fallout zone. 15 minutes after the event, they're getting almost 100 R per hour. And as the cloud sort of rolls over them, that increases to over 100 R per hour. But then watch what happens. You see how the area is shrinking and the radiation levels are dropping off? That's that decay we were talking about. And in fact, at 4 hours, the dangerous fallout zone shrinks past them because the radiation levels die off so fast that they now are outside of the dangerous fallout zone. So that's 5 miles away. Let's go in a little bit closer. At 1.5 miles, Cardozo High School is really in the sucker punch of the fallout. I'm going to have to change scales here. I've kept the Prince George's County radiation levels there as reference, but for Cardozo, their 15-minute reading is almost 1,500 R per hour. Once again, don't worry about the numbers, but watch the trend. So as I start the animation, you can see how quickly those radiation levels drop off. Now, they're still going to be higher than Prince George's County, but it's the trend we need to watch. Because understanding when radiation levels are highest is the key to surviving this incident. All right, so a little key points here. Fallout decays rapidly. The primary hazard are these salt and sand-sized particles falling down from the upper atmosphere that give off waves of penetrating radiation. It's not this invisible, well, first off, it's not purple. Sorry, but all my animation is purple because, you know, that's the symbol for radiation. But you don't actually see purple particles or purple gaseous clouds or even the purple waves of radiation. But you will see particles. As it comes down, it's visible levels of debris falling down. It's not a significant inhalation hazard. People always worry about breathing in hazardous material. No, the primary concern from this is the radiation given off by the particles. Breathing it is not a big issue. And finally, where you are in a building makes a difference. Because as the particles come down, they're going to land on rooftops and on the ground. And the areas next to these locations, like the top of the building or around the bottom floor of a building, are the places where you can get exposed. But if you can get into a basement area that is blocked by some dirt, or in a office building, the core of the office building, the elevator lobbies, where you're away from the roof and away from the ground, it actually offers great protection. Single-story wood-framed houses, not so much. That's only a factor of 2 or 3. Think of these numbers like SPF of sunscreen. The bigger the number, the better the protection. But if you can just get into even a shallow half basement, it offers great protection. A protection factor of 10 is considered adequate by the planning guidance. All right, so let's take a look at our Cardozo High School location and figure out what kind of protection that community could offer. As we zoom into the area, I'm going to show you the exposure somebody might receive if they were, say, standing outside on the ground. Somebody in this area might get 1,500 rem of radiation. Now, once again, don't worry about the numbers. I color code it for you. It's in the not a happy day category. That is the area in which you would probably get a lethal exposure. Now, if you are in this neighborhood and you happen to look about, as I did, and you find, hey, look, there's a great single-story wood-framed house without a basement that I can run into, and you decide to go into there for shelter, that would reduce your exposure significantly, and you would probably get a survivable dose of radiation, but you're really not going to be very comfortable. This would definitely be in a range where you'd have severe radiation sickness. But if you run across the street from the high school and get into these brownstones, just a 3-story normal brownstone can easily offer protection factors of 5 to 15. That's going to reduce your dose to a point where you probably won't have symptoms, or if you do, they'd be mild illness that you would recover from. And if you can get into a building like the high school, a multi-story brick or cement building, get to the middle floors, or this high school actually has 2 subterranean floors, you would get a low enough exposure that you'd have no physical symptoms from the fallout exposure. And in fact, when we modeled everybody, this is just fallout casualties, not prompt effects, but if everybody in DC did the same thing, actually in the NCR did the same thing, and that was to stand outside for 24 hours, not the recommended strategy, by the way, you would have about 280,000 people that would get enough exposure to make them sick or potentially kill them. But even going into an inadequate shelter, that protection factor 3 wood-framed house without a basement, even an inadequate shelter can save 150,000 people from significant exposure. And if you can get into that adequate shelter, this building is more than adequate, but you know, the basement of a single-story wood-frame house, or a brownstone, or you know, the worst shelter location in an office building, we would save 245 out of those 280,000 people from significant exposure. And the people that did get a significant exposure, they still tend to be in the sick but not dead category. That's why 10 is considered adequate. And if you can get into, you know, an underground area or the middle floors of an office building, if everybody in the National Capital Region were able to do that, we would have no significant exposures from fallout. All right. So hopefully I've convinced you that sheltering is an effective mechanism to keep you safe. The next question I always get is, all right, so we're all here, bad thing happened, we all ran to the center of the building, we're all sheltered. How long do we have to wait it out? You know, I like you guys, but a week? How long is that food buffet going to last? So let's watch our dangerous fallout zone. This is 15 minutes after the event. 30, an hour. At an hour, the dangerous fallout zone actually reaches its maximum because the clouds dropped all of its particles, it's moved on, and now it's got nothing but decay. So an hour after the event, I've drawn this dotted yellow line around to show you its maximum extent. An hour 30, 45, 2 hours, it's already shrunk by half. 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. So our high school right here, you know, when do we make a break for heading out of the area? And in fact, at 12 hours, a day, 2 days, you can see that dangerous fallout zone shrinking down, and in fact, at a week, it's gone. So to help analyze this problem, street and get out of the area by that evacuation route. Now, since I broke the city down into these 100 by 100 meter blocks, I actually know what the exposure is at any given time on any given block, and we can calculate what it is for this particular case. All right, so let's look at our high school. I'm going to give it a protection factor of 50. It's actually, you can find better protection in that building, but I'm using that as an average. If you stay in that building, sorry, this is the sciencey part, but if you stay in that building, this is the exposure you get over time. If you leave at any particular time, this is the additional exposure you would get. So if you tried to leave at half an hour, you would get that exposure while running out of the area because you're trying to evacuate while the radiation levels are highest. But if you wait 2 hours, it drops down to this level. And in fact, a little bit of numbers here. Inside sheltering, you would get about 20 R of exposure. running through the fallout on your way out of the shelter, you would get about 50 R of exposure, giving out for this particular shelter location and that evacuation pathway, your best option is to stay there for 25 hours. Now, the planning guidance recommends 12 to 24 hours as just sort of a baseline. And I wish I could say, oh, look at all the science, we're done. We know exactly what everybody should do, stay sheltered for 25 hours, that's it. But unfortunately, it's not that simple. It depends on what kind of structure you're in. Because if you're in that single-story wood frame house, this is that same location and running out that same pathway, but that house is not offering you as much protection. So you're better off actually leaving earlier, almost 2 hours after the detonation rather than 25. Now, if you get it, I found this picture of this brownstone that's actually next door to the high school. And a skinny brownstone where you're open on either side so the radiation can penetrate in. That's more like a protection factor of 7. Your options are more like 4 hours is your best time. If you're across the street in the worst shelter location in those brownstones, 5 hours. But the point of these slides is not to tell you exactly what to do, but to show you the trend. If I'm your health physicist, whether you evacuate at 4 or 5 hours or even 25 hours, that's sort of all in the same kind of exposure frame, plus or minus 20%. Just don't evacuate there in the first hour of the event. That's when you're going to get hurt. Try to hunker down at least an hour. All right, here's the conclusions. Public protection strategy, early adequate shelter. Try to find a protection factor 10 or better. You have a few minutes. It takes a minute or two for that cloud to even stabilize. And the further away you are, the more time you have to get to shelter. Now, that also may incite people to say, oh, well, if I'm really far away, if I'm in Annapolis, I'll see the cloud coming, I can do the quarterback maneuver and sort of get out of its way. But that cloud is going to be spreading out as it moves downwind. So the amount of travel you have to do to avoid it increases as well. So shelter is still the best option, even if you can get an idea where the cloud's coming. And frankly, for folks in Delaware, they'll hear about the bad news, they know the wind's coming their way, but it would be impossible for them to estimate in that kind of time frame whether the cloud is going to go to the south or the north of them, or right on top of them. So sheltering for the first hour can keep you alive. Be prepared to shelter for 24 hours. Knowing what to do before the event is critical. And, we always talk about being prepared at home. I'm sure everybody here, since this is a CERN meeting, has their kit at home, right? They've got their hand crank radio, 24 hours of food and water, their medicines, and I'm sure your family plan on how to reunite with your family or communicate with your family. But do you have that at work? Do you have at least a radio at work? So if the electricity goes out, do you have a radio that could receive some instructions on where to go and what to do? All right, so this is where I take a pause and do a